Hi friends, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Rabbi Julia Andelman here, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and we're so pleased that you are with us today for our pre-Pesach webinar for rabbis, Meaning from Magid, Contemporary Scholarship, Contemporary Messages with our teacher and colleague, Rabbi Dr. Judith Hauptman. Just a few announcements before we start. A couple of upcoming programs. We've had an amazing series of live online mini courses this year that a number of you have participated in, but we have one coming up that's especially for rabbis and others with advanced tech skills. That will be with Professor Ben Summer on Tehillim, starting on April 12th. And then in May, one with Professor Barbara Mann, Peretz, Kafka, Chagall, a Jewish modernist triptych, something different. So we'll send you emails about those. And then for the conservative rabbis among you, we have our summer conference this year, Beyond the Chuppah, a rabbinic learning conference on working with interfaith families, which I'm pleased to say is being co-sponsored by the Rabbinical Assembly. That's July 16th to the 18th. And again, you'll get email from us about that. I'm pleased to acknowledge my JTS colleagues here in the room, Rabbi Tim Bernard, our Director of Digital Learning and Engagement, who organizes this series for you, and our awesome new media staff, Larry and Marissa. Thank you. So the program today should last about an hour and 15 minutes. If you haven't already printed the sources, you can download them using the link right above the video on your screen. Professor Hauptman will answer specific questions as needed throughout the webinar if you have a clarification question, and then we'll reserve 15-20 minutes at the end for Q&A specifically. So feel free to submit questions in the chat window below the video at any time. That's the best way to submit your questions. If you're having some issue with the chat window, you can email your question also to rabbinicresources@jtsa.edu. rabbinicresources@jtsa.edu. Please put webinar question in the subject line, but if you can, use the chat window, and we'll get to as many questions as we have time for. Okay, so it's now my great pleasure to introduce Judith Hauptman, the E. Billy Avery Professor Emerita of Talmud and Rabbinic Culture at JTS. She's Emerita, but she is still doing all this teaching for us, so we're so happy about that. Her scholarly research focuses on unraveling the mystery of how the Talmud came into being and on investigating women's roles in Judaic thought, bringing the social and ethical norms of the rabbinic period into dialogue with contemporary issues. Dr. Hauptman has authored 3 books and many articles, academic and popular. Her undergraduate degree, her MA, and her PhD were all from JTS, and as you know, she was the first woman to ever receive a doctorate in Talmud, and she's been teaching here at JTS since 1973. More recently, in 2003, she was ordained by AJR, and she is also the founder of Ohel Ayala, an outreach project that serves hundreds of young Jews on the margins. And I'm going to leave out the rest of your amazing bio in the interest of time and turn it over to you. Thank you so much for teaching us today.
Good afternoon. I think all of us at this time of year start scrambling for new material to talk about at our Passover Seders. So I scrambled a little bit earlier, and I have a couple of texts that I hope will be cause you some new insights, bring you some new insights. I think at our Seders, we generally love to discuss the 4 questions, the 4 children, used to be known as the 4 sons, the 5 rabbis, and even the 10 plagues, although I personally don't like the 10 plagues because I'm uncomfortable talking about the suffering of others. But the heart of the Haggadah is the Magid, as we go, Kadesh Rachatz, Karpas Yachatz, Magid. And the Magid section is filled with many, many biblical verses, and it's often difficult, even to ourselves, to understand what exactly, in what way exactly the Magid is enriching us. So this year, because I do lead large public seders, this year I decided to look at the Magid as a whole and see what I could come up with. Could I grasp its main messages better by looking at it large scale rather than focusing on it bit by bit, which is generally what we do when we read the Haggadah. We read a phrase and then explanation. So before we get into the Magid verses themselves, the choices made by the rabbis of the Mishnah is that we tell the story by reading midrashically verses from Deuteronomy, verses Deuteronomy 26, 5, 6, 7, and 8. These are the verses
that the Torah prescribes that a Jew recite when he or she brings Bikurim to the temple. Now, when the rabbis chose these verses, there were no more Jews bringing Bikurim to the temple because the second temple had been destroyed. But it could be out of remembrance of the past, if in fact this is how it all happened. It could be in remembrance of the past they chose these verses. There are a number of theories as to why these particular verses. What I have read is that this is the shortest version of the Exodus story that you will find in the entire Chumash. It's also true that these verses express gratefulness, gratitude to God for liberating our ancestors from Egypt, and that Bikurim connection possibly made these verses more recognizable. It seems that the Haggadot, which survived from Eretz Yisrael that were found in the Geniza, they don't just include Deuteronomy 5, 6, 7, 8, but they add verse 9, which you have at the bottom here, which says, "Vayivienu el hamakom hazeh," God brought us to this land, land flowing with milk and honey. So contemporary research argues that the expression in the Mishnah that we should go from gnut to shevach, from disgrace to praise, that these verses actually fulfill that requirement, because if you look at it through the eyes of Haggadot Eretz Yisrael, the opening words, Arami Oved Avi, we'll get to how we interpret them in our Haggadot in a moment, but in the Eretz Yisrael Haggadot, they understood Arami Oved Avi not as a reference to Laban, which, as I say, we will get to. They understood this as our father Jacob, who went to Padan Aram, our father Jacob was a wanderer, and the verse continues and says, Vayered Mitzrayim, and he went down to Egypt and lived there. So the Eretz Yisrael Haggadot are arguing that the gnut, the disgrace, so to speak, is leaving the land of Israel. And if you include verse 9, Vayivienu el hamakom hazeh, the shevach is returning to the land of Israel. That's Haggadot Eretz Yisrael. The Babylonian tradition, which is the tradition at the basis of our Haggadot today, the Babylonian tradition lops off, that's ancient, lops off verse 9 and reinterprets the words Arami Oved Avi. It's kind of a prologue to this midrash, and it says the Arami is not a reference to Jacob our father, but is a reference to Laban, whom Jacob spent some time with. And Laban, Oved, grammatically speaking, this is difficult, but Laban sought to destroy, did not succeed, but sought to destroy our father Jacob. You can go back to the book of Genesis and figure out exactly what that means. It's not 100% clear, but it could be that there was intention in reinterpreting those words to refer to Laban seeking to destroy Jacob, because that is a different way of talking about gnut, as opposed to leaving the land and coming back to the land. We now have slavery, what ultimately resulted in slavery, as the disgrace, and then liberation as the shevach, as the praise. So that's some general aspects on these verses that are at the heart of the Haggadah. But now, for years now, I have looked at these midrashim, and I say to myself, I really don't understand what's going on here. In what way are these midrashim teaching me something about the story that I didn't know by simply reading the words? So I've color-coded it, and I'm hoping that whether you printed it out or whether you're looking at it on screen, that you've got the colors in front of you, because the colors are very important. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the colors. I used blue. There's no particular choice to my color reasons for choosing these colors. Blue, which you can see is the dominant color here. Everywhere where you see blue, it introduces a verse. Oh yes, I did not color the base verses from Deuteronomy, Vayered Mitzrayim, Vayagar Sham, Bimtei Ma'at, because those, you understand, are our base verses. But whenever the Midrash would align a verse from elsewhere, not necessarily from Deuteronomy 26, but whenever the Midrash would align a verse with a snippet of the main verse from Deuteronomy, it would say Shene'emar or Kama Shene'emar, and I indicated that in blue. So you see blue as dominant. The second most dominant color is green, And what I did is I indicated in green every time a verse is brought from Exodus. So you see the general understanding of this midrash is we break down the verses from Deuteronomy 26, 5, 6, 7, 8 into short snippets, and then we align to every short snippet in Deuteronomy a verse from Exodus where the story of the Exodus itself and the liberation from slavery is told in much greater length. So you see a lot of green here. On occasion, there are a couple of yellows, because on occasion, instead of bringing a verse from the Chumash, the people who wrote this midrash, the authors of the midrash, brought a verse from elsewhere in the Bible. But those are rare. There are only 3 yellows. And finally, and there are 1 or 2 verses. There's a verse from Genesis and 1 or 2 verses from Devarim. I did not indicate those in any color. There are not a lot of them. And finally, the pink. And this is very important to me for the point I'm going to make shortly. Up until, on page 2, or verse, Vanitzak el Adonai Eloheinu vayishma Koenu vayarat onyenu et amlenu vet lachatzenu. That's verse Gimel. You notice there, starting with number 3, Gimel 3, there is pink, and the pink appears in virtually, with the exclusion of 1 midrash, it appears in every midrash going down. So what you see here is a shift from the original midrashic style of aligning a verse from Exodus to a snippet of verse from Deuteronomy. From here on in, we've got the Exodus-Deuteronomy thing going on, but starting here, there's an equation. Vayar et onyenu, God saw our misery. Zo prishut derech eretz. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then there's a verse, as you see from Exodus, Vet amalenu elo habanim. And then there's a verse again from Exodus. So this is a typical midrashic technique in which the author of the midrash is telling you that a word in the base verse is going to be interpreted sometimes according to the very simple meaning of what that word, but sometimes further afield. And midrash surely permits going further afield, moving out of the limited semantic range of what a word means and going further afield. So I want to focus now on 3 aspects. In other words, we see a coherent midrash. I'm claiming that because aligning verses from Exodus continues throughout. The first half has similar structure, and then when we start with Zo Prishut Derech Eretz, going down, there too there's similar structure. So I'm looking at this as a coherent whole, and what I would like to do is focus on 3 discrete units here. I'm going to do them a little bit out of order. The first unit I'm interested in focusing on is Vayar et onyenu. That's Gimel 3 and 4. When I read these words, Vayar et onyenu, God saw our misery, and then the midrashic interpretation, equivalence of onyenu, Zo prishut derech eretz. Prishut derech eretz means refraining from sexual intercourse, meaning husbands and wives ceased engaging in intimate relations with each other in order not to produce a child. I say those words in order not to produce a child because that is clearly the intent of what's coming up. So let me say it again. Vayar et onyenu, God saw our misery. This is what God saw, that husbands and wives refrained from relations with each other. The supporting verse, Vayar Elohim et bnei Yisrael, Vayeda Elohim, that is from Shmot, but there's nothing in that verse which comes even close to saying the husbands and wives refrained from sexual intimacy. So that's problematic. In other words, when I read the words Vayar et onyenu, and then I see the midrashic interpretation, Zo prishut derech eretz, I'm perplexed, and I'm also perplexed by the supporting verse. Now I'm going on to the next section 4, V'et amalenu. Amalenu is misery. And let me just check. When I translated onyenu, if I said misery, I didn't mean that. I should have said affliction or some other word of that similar word. Now I'm going on V'et amalenu. Now I must say that the word amal in Hebrew, certainly in contemporary Hebrew, we use it referring to work. But if you look up all the references to amal, all the uses of the root, ayin mem lamed, in the Torah, it becomes, and even in the rest of Tanakh and Nach, amalenu becomes misery, and that is the JPS translation. So God saw our amalenu, our misery, elo habanim. And again, I scratch my head and I say, what? God sees our misery. Now, the way I understand the misery in Egypt is the slaves are being treated in difficult ways. They're subjected to harsh conditions, difficult labor. Amalenu, these are the children. And then the supporting verse says, every son that is born to you, throw him into the Nile, but the daughters you can let live. Let me just remind you, that verse, as it's stated here, is from Exodus chapter 1, verse 22. You see, Pharaoh first went to the Israelite Jewish midwives and said to them, when you see on the birthing stool that it is a boy, kill the boy. But the midwives, as you all know, did not listen to Pharaoh. So then Pharaoh, in an act of, I'd say, unmitigated evil and cruelty, says to his entire nation, El Kol Amo, he says to his entire nation, when you Egyptians see that a boy is born to an Israelite family, you take that baby and you toss that baby into the Nile, but you can let the girls live. So this is a verse of extreme cruelty, and that verse, the Et Amalenu, so the point I want to make is this, Anyenu and Amalenu are both interpreted in ways that stray quite far from the simple meaning of those words. And my argument is as follows, that we saw here, starting with Vayarat Anyenu, a shift in the Midrashic method, a need for the Midrashist to tell you what Anyenu means, Zo Prishut Erech Eretz, Amalenu, Elu Habanim, because in these Midrashim, unlike all the previous Midrashim of this unit, and to a great extent, unlike all the Midrashim that are going to follow, and here we're in the middle of the large unit of Midrash, it seems to me that this Midrashist wanted to say, well, in Deuteronomy 26, 5-8, there's no reference to Pharaoh wishing to obliterate an entire people. There's no reference to Pharaoh telling adults to kill children. And therefore, this Midrashist, unlike his other Midrashim in this entire unit, said, I'm going to bring in from Exodus, even if it doesn't fit the words exactly. But as I say, that doesn't matter, because in Midrash, you don't have to fit the words exactly. There is room for interpretation. So it seems to me that the key message of this entire unit of Midrash is that Pharaoh, in a way, I'm going to use a modern term now, Pharaoh thought up genocide, or Pharaoh was the first to attempt to commit genocide against the Jewish people by killing off all the male babies. And as I say, I think it's a double message. I think that this Midrash is giving us a message for today and telling us that yes, obliterating an entire people, erasing an entire people is as morally reprehensible as one can imagine, as is harming children at the hands of adults, and we know that that is happening in the world today. You know, we're talking here about drowning baby boys, about that possibility, and today, I think you remember that heart-rending picture of that baby boy washed up dead on the shores that we saw in the newspapers a couple of years ago. So today we have children suffering at the hands of adults by drowning, by starvation, in other ways. And of course we have today attempts in various places around the world at genocide. It seems to me that the author, anonymous, I have no idea who it was, and there could be many authors here, but some author saw it fit to highlight in the Magid, in the Haggadah, smack in the middle of it, as it switches from the one kind of midrash to this, what's called deictic, Zo, Elu, and so on. It seems to me that is a key message that midrashist is bringing to our attention. The second midrash that I want to look at is this very familiar one. If we, on the same page, if you look down to verse Daled, Vayotzienu Adonai miMitzrayim, and so on, there we do see that there's no pink. This is the one midrash in the pink section that doesn't have any pink, but it does have a Shnei Amar, and it does have a verse from Shmot. And I think we all know this famous midrash, Vayotzei Adonai miMitzrayim lo al yedei malach v'lo al yedei saraf v'lo al yedei shaliach el HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvodo u'v'atzmo. In other words, God himself, I use the masculine gender for ease of reference, God himself intervened and took us out of Egypt. And then underneath you see there A, B, C, D. Those are often printed in the Haggadah in smaller letters or in parentheses because they are just repeating what this midrash says, Lo yedei malach, lo yedei saraf. They're taking the verse from Shmot, Yud Bet, and showing how there's perhaps some superfluity there, and each piece of Shmot, Yud Bet leads to the point, God himself, no intercessors, no intermediaries, and if you like, not even Moshe. It's hard to know if this is a polemic against Christianity or not. Some people say yes, others say no. But that midrash doesn't quite fit the pattern in which it appears because it doesn't have in that zo. But now I want to turn to the last, what I'm calling somewhat unusual midrash. So if you go back to verse Aleph on page 1, Midrash 6 under verse Aleph. Verse Aleph is Arameo Vedavi. We've spoken about that a little bit. But I got interested in the Midrash that begins with the word Varav, Rivava, Ketsemach, Hasadene, Tatich, and so on. So just to be a little bit personal about it, I grew up in a home where we read the entire Haggadah. My father, his brother, and my grandfather chanted the Haggadah out loud, word for word for word. They knew Hebrew. And I don't remember how old I was when I began to understand this midrash, but at some point, when they got to this midrash at the Seder on Passover night, I would cringe because this, I'm sure I cringed even more when I was a teenage girl, because this midrash is talking in very explicit terms about the sexual development of a girl. And for years, I wondered, why is this verse in the Haggadah? And I now have an answer, which I'm going to share with you. I will say at the outset, there is something I think very beautiful and meaningful going on here, and I'm also going to read it to the Brit Milah shortly. So looking at this midrash, Varav, Kamo shene'amar, Rivava Ketsemach Hasadeh, it seems to me that the word Rivava, which has more than one meaning, we know David hika, Shaul hika ba'alafav, David b'rivavotav. Rivava means 10,000. In general, it does not mean 10,000 here. But that doesn't matter, because when you're writing midrash, if you want to say we multiplied and became very numerous in Egypt, then if you find a verse that has the word rivava and it's somehow talking about reproduction, or at least the organs of reproduction, it's like you've nailed it. You've got a good midrash there. So I am convinced, I have a feeling I'm alone in this at the moment, but I'm convinced that the midrashist brought this verse because he could deceptively suggest to you that when you see rivava, you right away say, the Jews, they became thousands, 10,000s and more in Egypt. But that's not what the verse means. So if you look at the JPS translation, Rivava ketsemach hasadeh tatich means I let you grow like the plants of the field. And plants of the field have a way of spreading out and creeping all over. So, that's close to the word rivava. The root is to grow, to become numerous. Vatirbi, vatigdali, vatavoy, badiadayim, you grew up. The words vatavoy, badiadayim, I'm not going to take a stand on what those mean. I leave that to the biblical scholars. Shadayim nachonu usarech tzimeach. This is where teenage girls can definitely cringe. Your breast grew firm, your hair sprouted, probably a reference to pubic hair. Va'at erom ve'eryah, and yet you are bare and naked. Now you're still going to say to yourself, what has this got to do with the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and why is it in the Haggadah, and did the rabbis really enjoy reciting at the Seder? Whichever rabbis introduced this, did they really enjoy reciting the words Shadayim Nachonu Usarech Semeach? Well, to that last question, I'm actually going to say yes. It's a little edgy, and I wouldn't be surprised, even though there's a larger point that I'm going to make shortly, I wouldn't be surprised if they did not mind reciting out loud at the same these particular sexually, physically tinged words. Well, what's going on here? Before I read the second verse, Va'avor alayach, that happens to be verse 6, which in the book of Ezekiel precedes Rivavakat Tzemach Hasadeh. This is a rare instance in which the supporting verses are out of order, but it's true that in the Mechilta, where this also appears, the verses are out of order there as well. And some Haggadot don't include Va'avor alayach, although many of the Haggadot that I have seen do include it, sometimes in smaller letters. So what's going on here? All right, first there's the Pshat. If you go to the book of Ezekiel and you read this entire chapter, it's about God's kindness to the Jewish people. God is saying, among other things, that a woman gave birth in the field, and she immediately abandoned her newborn girl, her baby girl. She abandoned that girl. And what did God do? This is obviously a metaphor for the Jewish people. God came and took that child as a foundling and raised that girl for years and years until she grew up, until she blossomed physically. So this is about God's, so the understanding of the metaphor is just as, you can abandon baby in the field. Oh yes, the words that are coming up here are in the verse 6, which precedes verse 7, Va'avor alayach, I passed by you, and I saw I saw you wallowing in your blood. The blood here is the blood of afterbirth. And va'omar lach, and I said to you, bidamaya chayi, that despite your blood, or blood of the afterbirth, or because of the blood, you will live, you will live. And then God takes in the foundling, and so on. So this is a verse which the rabbis in the Mechilta, which is a midrashic commentary in the book of Shemot, they actually read this verse as a metaphor for God rescuing the Jews, liberating the Jews from the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. But there's more going on here. This part about Va'at Erom ve'eryah, you are bare and naked. The Midrash in the Mechilta says you are bare and naked of mitzvot, and in order to be redeemed by God, yes, maybe God loves you and maybe God took you in as a foundling, but there is a covenant, there is an arrangement, there are promises that we need to make to God, and Erom ve'eryah and blood, the rabbis interpret as you were wallowing in the blood of the mitzvot. God gave you mitzvot, Dam Milah and Dam Pesach, the blood of circumcision, the blood of the Paschal Lamb. God gave you those two mitzvot so that you could observe them even back then and become worthy for God to take you out of Egypt. So these two verses, the first one talking about you're naked, meaning naked of mitzvot. You see, the problem, of course, is the Midrash is not here. Only the verses from Ezekiel are here. And even though these verses from Ezekiel are here to explain the word varav, if you just read the Haggadah, as I did for many years, you have no idea, I think, you have no idea what these verses are telling us about the Exodus from Egypt. But if you look up the Midrashic interpretation of these two verses, you discover that in an ancient way, the rabbis of the Talmud already connected these verses with the Exodus from Egypt, and therefore hiding behind these words of great physicality is the spiritual notion that God expects us to keep mitzvot, and the rabbis understood the mitzvot as relating to blood because of the expression mitbosesed b'damayach, and they said dam milah and dam pesach. So now let me just leave Pesach for a moment and say something about Brit Milah. I don't know about you, but when I go to a Brit Milah of a boy, of course, and I hear the verse, Va'omar lach b'damaya chayiva and v'damaya chayiva, avor alayach, this whole verse, not the first verse, not Rivavakat Tzemach Hasadeh, but Va'avor alayach, and I hear that verse at a Brit Milah, and probably you can hear echoing in your ears right now, Va'omar lach b'damaya chayiv, because we're all expected to say Va'omar lach b'damaya chayiv. I never knew why that verse was being recited at Brit Milah. And now I understand it, because at the Brit Milah, like the Haggadah, you're supposed to read this verse and automatically understand it midrashically. So when we say mitbosesa b'damayach chayi and so on, you say, yes, this is a Brit Milah, because Brit Milah is one of those mitzvot that God gave the Jews in Egypt to make them worthy of redemption, and we're still keeping that mitzvah of Brit Milah to this very day. So that's an aside. That's about Brit Milah. And now coming back to Pesach, this little piece about Revavah Tzemach Hasadeh, I discovered it last year, that's what it means, I think, in the Haggadah, and I shared it at my public seders, and people accepted it. So I'm suggesting that if you are feeling the way I used to feel, that these verses made me extremely uncomfortable, again, if people don't know Hebrew, and the English is usually very delicately done, although the JPS tells it like it is, all right? So yes, you can see these verses as evidence of God's loving kindness, adopting the Jewish people as a foundling, as a baby, when they were in Egypt, abandoned by everybody else, and he takes them, embraces them lovingly, takes them out of Egypt, and brings them ultimately to the Promised Land. So those are my comments on the making meaning from Magid, and I hope that you don't just skip over Magid, as many of us are wont to do, by saying, it's all these biblical verses. Let's just read the four verses, which of course you can do. In many Haggadot, the four verses are given to you as a unit at the very beginning. It's sort of true that if you just read those four verses, maybe you have fulfilled what the Mishnah requires of you to recite at the Seder, but you didn't do the Doresh, the Midrashic part of it. So I would highly recommend that at your Seders, you can talk about the unit as a whole, but then pick 2 or 3 Midrashim and expand upon them. The next set of texts in this handout, I have side by side Mishnah Masechet Pesachim Perek Yud and Tosefta Masechet Pesachim Perek Yud, Halacha Aleph in both of them. And let me point out a difficulty in these two texts. I can mention briefly how Shama Friedman resolves this difficulty, and then I'm going to disagree with him and suggest something slightly different. Arvei Pesachim Samuch Lemincha on Passover Eve from early in the afternoon, or 3:30 or so in the afternoon, Lo yochal adam ad shetechshach, build up an appetite, don't eat until darkness. Vafilu anisha b'Yisrael lo yochal ad sheyasev, even a poor person in Israel on Seder night should have his meal reclining, because as we know from the later added fourth question, Misubin, reclining is a way of free men being served by others, and you're certainly not a slave if you're reclining at your meal. And poor people, I know the word slave is not here, but the poor in many ways are similar to slaves because their lives are in a sense so difficult, and the labor they have to perform is hard. V'lo yifchatulo me'arba kosot shel yayin v'afilu min hatamchui. Now here's the difficulty. They shall not give him fewer. Yifchatu is from the, like pachot. They shall not give him fewer than 4 cups of wine, even from the soup kitchen. So who is the him? Lo yifchatu lo. All right, so, right away you'll say, we're talking about this ani, this poor person. He should be at the Seder, he should recline at the Seder like somebody rich, and like somebody rich at banquets, which we know from Greco-Roman texts and even from rabbinic texts, had courses and had multiple cups of wine. So this poor person at the Seder, they should give him, meaning he should be served at the Seder, he should recline, he should be served, he should receive 4 cups of wine, even if he's so poor that he's getting his meal from the soup kitchen. There are grades of poverty, and this is the lowest grade, that you don't even have enough for 1 or 2 meals, and you need to go to the soup kitchen. But I'll still say the word lo yafchatu lo, is not 100% clear, although it's okay, I will admit it's reasonable clear in the Mishnah. But now let's go right across the page to the Tosefta. The first line is identical. Erev Pesachim, Samuch Lemincha, Lo Yochal Adam Ad Shetechshach. Fine. Afilu anisha b'Yisrael lo yuchal ad sheyasev. That's just like the Mishnah, that there is no vav in front of afilu. Vavs come and go, it's not significant. Then the Tosefta says, V'lo yifchatu lo me'arba kosot shel yayin. And that's still like the Mishnah, but then the Tosefta goes on and says, Sheyesh behen kedei revi'it, that each of these cups has a fourth of a log of wine. I'm not an expert on measures, but shall we say each has 3 ounces, minimally 3 ounces. They should not give him fewer than 4 cups of wine, each of which contains a fourth of a log. Ben chai be mazug, whether it's undiluted wine, chai, or mazug, or wine made strong but diluted with water. There's a lot in the Talmud about that. Ben chadash, ben yashan, whether it's new wine or aged wine. These are the rules for the 4 cups. The 4 cups of wine that are going to be drunk at the Seder. And then we have a dissenting opinion, or a supplementing opinion. Rabbi Yehuda he says, well, these rules about the wine are fine, provided, and here's an additional limitation, provided the wine tastes like wine and looks like wine, which is generally understood to be drink red wine at the Seder. So here's the problem. The lo yifchatulo in the Tosefta, with all those rules about the wine, mazug, chai, chadash, yashan, and so on, is the Tosefta stating right there that every Jew, not just poor, but every Jew is expected to drink at the Seder 4 cups of wine, and it doesn't matter whether it's fresh wine or aged wine and so on? Or is the Tosefta talking about the poor person from the preceding line? Well, Shama Friedman, through interesting analysis, arrives at the conclusion that v'lo yifchatu lo in the Tosefta, the lo is referring to the poor of the previous line. Okay, I disagree for the following reason. If you look down at the very last text, Bavlei Psachim Kufchet Bet, I don't have time to read all of it, but let me read the first part of it and then I'll skip some. Mamar Rav Yehuda Mar Shmuel, this is early, Shmuel is first generation Babylonian Mora, Rav Yehuda is a student. Arba'a kosot halalu, these 4 cups of wine, and at this point in Bavli Psachim, it's the 4 cups of wine that are being discussed. Arba'a kosot halalu tzarich sheyehi bahen kedei mizigat kos yafeh. We didn't see those words yet, so Shmuel is innovating and saying it should be a generous amount of wine. Now, exactly what generous means, how does it compare to Revi'it, Kedei Revi'it? The Gemara will take up a little bit later. And then Shmuel goes on to say, Shta'an chayatza, if you drink your 4 cups from undiluted wine, you have fulfilled your obligation of the 4 cups. Shta'an b'vat achat, if you drank all 4 cups, one after the other, this is a little bit hard for me to understand, but if you just gulp them down, one right after the other, maybe in some kind of competition, I don't know what. Yes, you have fulfilled, in other words, not spread them out through the evening, the way the Haggadah instructs you, you have fulfilled your obligation. Hishka mihem levanav ulvnei veito, if you give a sip of wine from your 4 cups to your children or to your wife, bnei beito was usually understood as wife, yatzah, even if you didn't drink the entire cup of wine yourself, but you gave them a sip, that's okay, you fulfilled your obligation. Then I'm skipping a couple lines down to Metivei. The lines I'm skipping just analyze each of those phrases. Metivei, arba'a kosot halalu tzarich sheyehi bahen kedei revi'it, echad chai v'echad mazug, echad chadash, echad yashan, Rabbi Yehuda omer, tzarich sheyehi bo tam umar'eh yayin. This is of interest to me right now because this Braita has divorced the rules of the 4 cups. These are exactly the same rules that we saw in the Tosefta. This is, in fact, a version of the halakha that we saw above in the Tosefta. But whereas in the Tosefta, this halakha begins with the words, v'lo yifchatulo, here it begins straight out with arba'a kosot halalu, and so on. I'm not going to continue and read the next 2 lines. They compare, how can you talk about kos yafeh if it says kedei revi'it, and the answer is going to be, well, they really mean the same thing, and so on. Fine, but my argument here, and I checked the Talmud Yerushalmi as well, my argument here is that, okay, not the Tanaim, but from the earliest Amoraim, they are viewing the rules of Kedei Revi'it, Ben Chai, Ben Mazug, as a rule for all Jews. These are the rules to follow when you set up your 4 cups at the Seder. So going back to the Tosefta, I am suggesting that it begins with don't eat until dark. It then talks about making sure that every single Jew, rich or poor, is able to recline like a free, rich person at the Seder meal, at the Seder evening. And then I think the Tosefta, when it says V'lo yifchatu lo me'arba kosot, I think it's talking about all Jews. Here are the rules of the 4 cups, and so on. And that's how I understand, that's how it seems to me, both the Bavli and the Yerushalmi are reading that section of the Tosefta. I understand that you could argue with me and say, well, how the Amoraim read the Tosefta isn't necessarily how the author of that rule in Tosefta meant it. Okay, but this is the best I can do and say to you, the earliest Amoraim, okay, not the Tanaim, but the earliest Amoraim are reading that part of the Tosefta as addressing all Jews. And now I go back to the Mishnah, and I'm going to suggest the following. The Mishnah begins the same way, don't eat until dark. Every Jew should have, even the poorest, should be reclining at the Seder meal. And then when the Mishnah continues and says, V'lo yichlatu lo me'arba kosot shel yayin, okay, you could say, if I stop right there, I could have the same interpretation as in the Tosefta. It's talking about, here's the requirement of 4 cups of wine at the Seder, and the lo, him, is talking about all Jews. By the way, I must add this detail. The Bavli makes it clear that women are just as obligated to drink 4 cups at the Seder as are men. Okay, we're coming back now to the Mishnah. If I stopped right there, I would interpret the Mishnah the way I interpreted the Tosefta. But the Mishnah continues with the words, Va'afilu min hatam choy, even from the soup kitchen. So it seems to me that the Mishnah is maintaining its focus on the poor. And it's saying, not only do we give the poor a meal in the state of reclining, which means he's going to be served rather than serving others, but he, okay, it's she too, but I'm just using he again for ease of reference, and of course the word here is lo, which is in the masculine, but he, the poor person, should be served to be able to drink at the Seder no fewer than 4 cups of wine, even from the soup kitchen. So again, why am I getting excited about this? It seems to me that the Mishnah is stating here a grand social ideal that we did not see in the Tosefta. Yes, the Tosefta wants the poor person to recline at the Seder, period. But it seems to me the Mishnah is saying, I want the poor person to recline. I want there to be egalitarianism, egalitarian practice at the Seder. No distinction between rich and poor. No distinction in terms of reclining. No distinction in terms of how much wine they're going to drink, or minimally that each is going to receive 4 cups of wine, which is a very respectable amount in a Greco-Roman banquet, although obviously they drank more as well. And it seems to me the Mishnah is saying men and women alike, and I'm going to get very contemporary now and say, if we're talking egalitarian, then we're also saying gay and straight alike. We're saying we're including trans, we're including disabled people. The Mishnah, the very first Mishnah of 10th chapter of Tractate Pesachim, which is the chapter about the Seder, and it's in its opening statement is saying to you, on this night of liberation from the land of Egypt, we are regarding all people as equal. We are disregarding, we are erasing, well, for one night in any event, we are erasing socioeconomic differences, we are erasing gender hierarchies, we are erasing heterosexual, homosexual hierarchies, we are erasing able and disabled. Everybody is to be treated at the Seder in the exact same way. It seems to me, is this the rabbi in me talking? Okay, but this is, I want to tell you, this is the scholar in me talking and telling you that it seems to me that in many, many instances, I certainly have written extensively on this subject, the Mishnah knew the Tosefta, not every Tosefta, but when the Mishnah occasionally, or often I should say, knows a halacha in the Tosefta, it tweaks it, and I think in this case, it upped the ante. It really made the, I will not deny that Tosefta talks about poor people, but I think the Mishnah is going even further and making it a more grand social message. I have a few more minutes, and I have two more topics I want to cover. So the next text on this handout is the famous one of the 4 questions, and I want to say the following. There are some wonderful new books out there about the Haggadah, about Mishnah Tosefta Psachim. So Mazgulo, I'm reading this Mishnah, Mazgulo kosheni v'kan haben shoel aviv. Fine, at the second, we pour the second cup, dilute the second cup, not strong wine, but diluted wine. And here is where the child, and I advisedly interpret ben as either ben or bat, because in the JPS translation, the word ben in the Torah can mean child. If it means child, it's ben or bat. If it means son, then it means only sons. So here the child asks the father, and then I highlighted v'mein dat ba ben aviv melamdo. So this is the question that scholars have asked for ages. The 4 questions that follow after the words aviv melamdo, if the son doesn't have da'at, if he doesn't have enough knowledge, enough ability to ask, then the father will teach him the following or recite the following for him or prompt him in the following way. Well, one of the latest commentaries that I read says put those words in parentheses. So it's kana ben shoel aviv. Parenthetically, if the child doesn't know the questions, the father has to prompt him, but that's parenthetical. And then here are the prescribed questions that the child asks the father. I personally am not convinced of that interpretation, because we have the phrase here, v'mein dat ba ben aviv melamdo. It's not so typical in these rabbinic texts to have that kind of parenthetical statement. And then at the end, one line, second line from the bottom of the Hebrew, ulefi dato shel ben aviv melamdo. That's kind of the same thing. There's a kind of inclusio here, teach him, and then lefi da'ato shel ben aviv melamdo. There seems to be a focus on what the father is going to be teaching the child. And why is this of significance at this point in time? Because if these are the questions that are prescribed for the father to ask the son, if the son, daughter, are able to ask questions, then they can ask their own questions. And if you look in Gemara Psachim, the 10th chapter, you'll find a couple of short anecdotes where, I don't know, Abaye asks a wise question like, why did they just move the tray table? And then Rabbi says to him, I can't remember if it's Rabbi or Rav Yosef, says, oh, pitartan milamar manishtana. Oh, now that you ask that, perceptive question, we no longer need to recite the, approved, the dictated in the Mishnah 4 questions. So, yes, there are 2 ways of understanding it, and I'm much happier saying there's freedom for the child to make up questions that he or she wants to ask. And if the child does that, I would recommend that you don't then recite the 4 questions, unless there's some other child at the table who prepared them and wants to recite them. But if a child asks questions of his or her own, accept those as the triggering questions, because when you ask a question and get an answer, the point that the answer is making is embedded much faster in your mind. The clarification is greater when there's a question and answer rather than just preaching. Yes, dear, let me tell you the story of the Exodus from Egypt. It's much better if you want to ask me some questions about this, the Seder rituals or the Exodus, whatever. Oh, and this is what you want to know, and I'm going to answer the questions that you are asking me. So on this topic, I see, I have 5 minutes more. Okay, I'm going to finish this and then say something about the Afikomen. So if we look ahead in the Mishnah, what you have here at Mishnah Yod Daled and the beginning of Mishnah Hey, at the beginning of Mishnah, let me read the beginning. Rabban Gamliel haya omer, kol shelo amar shlosha dvarim elu ba'Pesach, lo yatsa yedei chovato ve'elohein Pesach matzah umaror. Now, I think most of us know that the original questions were not 4 but 3, and those original 3 questions, one was about the Paschal sacrifice, one was about the matzah, and one was about the maror, or whatever lettuce they were eating as bitter herbs that night. So when Rabban Gamliel in the Mishnah says, you've got to mention these three things, and then he gives a line of explanation about each one, he's essentially giving the answers to those three questions. So I'm going to come to our Haggadah in a moment. But the flow of the evening in the Mishnah is questions, midrash on a couple of verses of the Exodus to give the kids historical background, to give the kids some sense of why the Exodus from Egypt, liberation from slavery, redemption, and coming to the Promised Land are so important. These are foundational events in Jewish history. So you begin with questions, you then do the midrash on those psukim and a couple of related texts, and then Rabban Gamliel says in the Mishnah, make sure you then give him direct answer, give him or her direct answer to the three questions. Here's why we talked about, asked about Pesach, about Matzah, and about Maror. And the interesting thing is, you can easily overlook this, but in today's Haggadot, that section about Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer comes at the very end of the Magid, and it's been rewritten. In other words, it doesn't, the part in the Haggadah about Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer, it doesn't just cite the Mishnah, it turns them into questions. Pesach shayu avotenu achlim b'Mitzrayim and so on, al shuma, matzah zo sha'anu achlim al shuma, maror al shuma, and then an answer is given to each of those. So we kind of preserve, we ask the questions at the beginning of the Seder, we go into this long Magid, and then it's like, in case you haven't noticed, because people always say to me, where are the answers to the four questions? And all over these years, I would always say, well, you know, the story of the Exodus is the answer to the four questions. If you look closely, you'll figure out why Pesach, why Matzah, why Maror. But you don't have to do that, because after you go through all the Magid, which I'm claiming is just giving you background for everything, then you get to the direct answer at the very end of the Magid, which is now formulated in our Haggadot as the main questions, Maza Pesach, Maza Maror, Shema, Maza Pesach, Matzah, Maror, and the answers. In case, kids, you missed the answer that we were trying to get at through all of our Magid Midrashim, we're going to tell you exactly now. And by the way, since the questions that we're reciting in our Seder, unless they're original questions, but if you go with the Haggadah's questions, you really should add at this point an answer to the two dippings and an answer to the Misubin question, because Rabban Gamliel did not know those questions and, of course, does not give us answers to those questions. So if you really want to satisfy, stay with the format of questions and answers, you need to explicitly answer, because I don't know if anywhere in the Magid you're really getting an explicit answer to the Misubin question. Finally, let me just close with a few words on the Afikomen, and this is material that I learned just recently. You know, the Mishnah ends the section about the Seder by saying, Ein maftirin achar Pesach afikoman. Do not do afikomen. And afikomen is a Greek word, and apparently means no carousing, no going from house to house, and so on after the Seder. This is a serious banquet. Go to sleep, all right? However, it then became no dessert. Both of those interpretations are found in the Gemara. It meant don't have any dessert. Don't have any dessert means let the taste of the Pesach linger in your mouth, because that has deep meaning for us. Well, when there's no more Pesach, we said, okay, we'll have a piece of matzah at the end of the meal. This is all in the Talmud. And let the taste of matzah linger in your mouth. But in the 12th century, for the very first time, that piece of matzah that lingers in the mouth that we have at the end of the Seder, which is that broken off pizza matzah that from the beginning of the Seder, it was only in the 12th century that that matzah piece began being called afikoman, which is in a way oxymoronic or impossible, because from ein maftirin achar Pesach afikoman, it now became maftirin achar Pesach afikoman. You are required, as of 12th century or so, to eat this piece of matzah, which we are now calling afikoman, at the end of the Seder. And two more interesting details. According to the Machzor Vitri, the leader of the Seder is supposed to take that broken matzah at the beginning of the Seder and put it under the tablecloth, all right? Apparently for the reason that it shouldn't get eaten until the end of the meal. And that seems to be why in the Simanei HaSeder, we say tzafun, Shulchan Aruch, tzafun barech. Why is this piece of matzah called hidden? It became a game. It became a game for the children to steal it and hide it, and for the Seder leader to find it and promise rewards and whatnot. But when did it become tzafun? And apparently it became tzafun roughly in the 12th, 13th century, when the instruction was given to put it under the tablecloth so that you leave it for the end of the meal, and before you know it, it became a game for children. So Ein Maftirin Achar Pesach Afikoman became Kein Maftirim Chayavim Lahaftir Achar Pesach Afikoman. All right, I hope these comments on various parts of the Haggadah enrich you in terms of what you know about the Haggadah, and you will be able to bring them to your own starim, whether they are private starim or community starim.
Thank you. All right, folks, this is your chance to send in your questions. As I said, ideally in the chat window. Otherwise, you can email rabbinic.resources@jtsa.edu. And hopefully you heard in the bio that I read at the beginning that Judith also is a master at leading large communal seders, especially for unaffiliated young Jews. So feel free to ask questions of the expert in that category as well. So while we're waiting for the questions to come in, I have a couple questions for you, if that's okay.
Okay.
All right, first, I have a theory, which I think that I heard some scholar say a long time ago, and it stuck with me, but I don't know who now. We call these the 4 questions all the time, and they really don't seem to me like questions, and I want to see what you think about this. So in the Mishnah, this is on page 3 of your packet, it says there, Mazgulo kos sheni, b'kan haben shoel aviv, v'im ein dat baben, aviv melamdo. And you could read it as like a colon there. And here's what the parent teaches. Ma'anishana, how different this night is from all the other nights in the following ways. And that gets rid of this question of where are the answers to the questions if they're not even questions to begin with. And reading it that way, Ma'anishana, how different this night is, seems to me to be sort of more consistent with Mishnaic Hebrew. So I wanted to see what you thought of the unnamed scholar's theory that has stuck with me.
Well, there's an ongoing scholarly debate about the words manishtana, whether a manishtana is exclamatory, how different, which would fit with aviv melamdo. So if the parent teaches the child, then the parent is just pointing out differences and then goes on after that to do the midrash and so on. But there still is a school of thought that these are questions. Why are we eating matzah without chametz tonight? Why maror? Other vegetables too, but why is the focus on maror? Not recently, but a number of years ago, I sing the praises of the Bar Ilan database. I went on my Bar Ilan database and I put in the words manish tana, and I looked at all the texts. But it's not uncommon. It is in fact reasonably common to have that phrase. And looking at those various texts, I personally arrived at the conclusion that I'm in the camp of manish tana as a question. For you to say, for the other side to say manish tana, then they have to look at the word ma. Nishtana we all understand in the same way, but ma, is ma the first word of a question, or is ma, how different this is? And I'm not sure, I don't know all the arguments that the other side brings that they can really interpret ma in that way. But let's say they can. I think this is going to be an unresolved debate. Both sides. I know where I stand, but there are lots of other good people.
An example of ma used in that way is like hinei ma tov u'ma-na'im, right? It's how, with an exclamation point, as opposed to...
Okay, that is a biblical verse.
Yeah.
But
True.
But okay.
Okay, so your research, based on your research, you think the likelihood that's a question is higher?
I lean towards the question. I certainly cannot say I have a definitive answer to this question that you just raised. I think both of them work, and I think both of them will lead to the more or less the same conclusions. Just to buttress my point of view is, so why did the Haggadah take Rabban Gamliel's statement from the Mishnah, which are surely declarative statements, and turn them into question-answer form? It seems to me there's this feeling that there should be questions and answers at the Seder. And even educationally, I think that's a better form than just putting it out there.
Okay, thank you. And a couple of questions starting to come in. I wanted to ask you another question. So this is going back to how you began with the problem of Arami Oved Avi and these midrashim, and what's supposed to be really the heart of the Seder, according to the Mishnah, having become sort of the most boring and I think the most random feeling for a lot of people.
Yes.
So I think you were getting at this, but I thought maybe I would ask you to just say a little more. So, so there are some of the ones that feel really the most random you addressed. I mean, this Va'aterum Veria is always like the biggest mystery, I think, of this part, so you addressed that. And Vet Amalenu Vet Lachatzinu. And then, but others are much more straightforward, / not always so interesting. Like I'm looking at the last one on page 2, number 6. Uva moftim zahadam k'mashne amar v'natati moftim v'shamayim v'aretz dam v'evetim rotashan. Fine, from Yoel. So okay, there's moftim here, there's moftim there, and they mention dam, and we have a plague of dam. I'm left with this feeling like, couldn't this have been more interesting? And I'm imagining if they were spending all night being Doresh this short version of the story of Pesach, it must have been more interesting than let me bring you a few parallel psukim that use the same words. So it seems like a shame that we've ended up with what we've ended up with, but maybe not. I don't know. What do you have to say about that?
So my first comment would be, yes, I shared that frustration for many, many years, and at my public seders, we read, the 4 questions and the 5 rabbis and Avadim Hayinu and all of that. When we got to the Magid, I would have my cantor just chant a little snippet here, a little snippet there, and we'd go right to the 10 plagues. Because I felt this doesn't speak to people. This doesn't really teach us anything. It seems so strained, like those midrashim that you point out.
And you mentioned at the beginning, it doesn't even really speak to us who have a sense of ownership over the text, I think, in many cases.
Well, that's true. So my first answer would be, between my looking into things last year about Varav and looking this year into Onyenu and Amalenu, I feel that I've redeemed a short piece of this. Also, people tend to get excited about this Lo Al Yidei Shaliach, even though scholars have not fully agreed that this is a polemic against Christianity. If you say that, I have never said this, I may this year, I don't know, I've never said at a public seder that that's what this is, but I can assure you, if I did say that, they would love it, all right? because it does give greater meaning to these verses. So in response to what you pointed out in Numbers 5 and 6 at the very end, it's a little bit of a game that they're doing there. When they say the otot zehamateh, it's like, can we find a verse in which mateh and otot both appear? And they found one. And then you go to moftim, and they interpret moftim as dam. Of course, I don't know if the verse came first or the midrash came first, but they say, can we find a verse in which we have both moftim and dam? And that's why they had to go to Yoel, outside the Torah, because that's where they found a verse in which moftim and dam, share a meaning or both appear in the same verse. So I would say the following, in the most general way of answering your question. There are, you can count them up, there are either 20 or 21 discrete midrashim here, and I think many of them are just auxiliary, that they're not really making a point.
Right.
I think if you're looking for meaning, then whoever, could be many authors wrote this midrash over years, it's an accumulation. Some of these midrashim do appear in our ancient collections of midrashim. So happens Amalenu and Onyenu, both of those are actually, one of those is in the Talmud, one of those is in the Mechilta. But it seems to me they kind of just filled it out, I hate to say it, but with fluff. that they had a couple of main points they wanted to make, and I say they or he or she or whomever. But to be, because the Mishnah says, Doresh me'arami oved avi ad sofa parasha, that okay, then we better find something to say about every little piece of Devarim 26:5-8. But really, there are only a couple of places where we're doing something interesting. And I think those three places are Varav and Onyenu Amalenu and the part about Lo Al Yidei Shaliach.
Right.
Most of the rest, there's almost no expansion.
And not to belabor the point, but I don't remember seeing Haggadah manuscripts that have kind of interesting alternatives to these fluff midrashim. Are you aware
The
of
conservative Haggadah definitely does.
You're talking about contemporary.
Oh, contemporary.
I was asking about
you meant back
old,
then.
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. No. Okay. So now you've going to elicit from me a comment which I forgot to make earlier. In the Haggadot from Eretz Yisrael, which, as I mentioned, turns up in the Geniza, you do not have this whole midrash. You actually have the verses 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You have the beginning, Vayored Mitzrayim Anus Al Pei Dibur, a little bit of that. And then it goes right to the end. It has Vayotzienu Mitzrayim Le'odei Malach, and then Vayivienu Hamakom Hazeh. And our own Jay Rovner from JTS, who wrote a very important article on the Haggadot of Eretz Yisrael, suggests that means that in Eretz Yisrael, this is an answer to your question, the Seder leader was free to discuss the other verses as he or she saw fit.
All right, thank you.
We can do that today.
Okay, we have a few questions related to the Afikoman piece at the end. I'll go with David Lerner's question. So he's asking if Tzafun is added at the end of the 13th century, according to what you're saying. How does that relate to Yachatz?
Fine. Okay. So according to the Talmud, Yachatz refers to derech ani beprusa. In other words, what does a poor person do? Okay, let me just back up. Yes, the grand social message of the Seder is equality, and the Yachatz is part of the equality. It used to be that there were only 2 matzahs on the Seder plate. I'll talk about how we got to 3 in a moment. There used to be 2. It was a whole matzah and then a broken matzah, because according to the Talmud, if you're poor and somebody gave you a loaf of bread, then you would eat half of it, break it, you would eat half, and the other half you would save for later, because you didn't know where your next meal was coming from. And that was the Yachatz message of the Seder. In other words, on all holidays, Shabbat and holidays, we put 2 loaves of challah on the table, whereas during the week, you only have like 1 loaf of bread, and there were different interpretations of why 2. But on Pesach, we would deviate from that and only put 1.5 to get out the message. On Pesach, we're concerned about the people who only have, a half rather than a whole, a half to eat now, the other half for later. Then the Ashkenazi custom developed apparently because people don't like to differentiate between Pesach and the other holidays and Shabbat. If it's 2 and 2, 2, 2, we want 2 whole loaves, whole matzahs on Pesach, and then the third one can be the broken one. So it kind of lost its meaning when we do that. By the way, the Sephardic custom was 1.5, but at a certain point, the Sephardim adopted the Ashkenazi custom. So that's how Yachatz relates to the message of saving people from poverty. Even the Halach Ma'anya, called we do have this focus in the Seder of let's all enjoy a full Seder meal. And Yachatz was part of that. And then, and the Afikomen actually does not relate to that.
They end up being related later on, you're saying?
Yes, but you mean, well,
the idea that the other broken half from the Yachatz comes back at some point.
Yes, right, that's true. So it comes back at the end. Yes, thank you for putting it like that. I didn't realize that. And then we remind ourselves of the broken matzah at the end of the Seder as well. Yes.
All right, and they've also taken the bait and would like to know your suggestions for leading a large multi-generational Seder, putting on your other hat.
Okay. There are a couple of things that I emphasize. Number one is that because people at the same table often don't know each other. They may have come in twos and threes, but many people came by themselves. So there's an introduction exercise. In other words, I make some announcements, and then I say, everybody at the Seder table, introduce yourself to each other. They're wearing name tags, that helps, but you really can't always see the name tag. And I give them a question to answer. Where did you last hide the afikomen? Of course, there are people who are not Jewish, so I have to formulate it more carefully. So that breaks the ice. But then it's extremely important to me that at a number of times during the Seder, I ask everybody to engage in what's called, and what I call, a table activity. I give them an assignment. And there's a table leader at every Seder table. There's a sticker on the inside of the Haggadah of just one person. He doesn't know, or she doesn't know who it is at the beginning, but they all open it up and they discover who's the leader. And they get an assignment for 5 minutes. And this year we're going to be talking about refugees, because that's like an obvious theme about the Seder, what's going on in the world. And that way, people, it breaks down ice, people talk to each other, and people express their own ideas. So that's important to me. And as far as I can see, people really like that aspect of it. Another thing is that I, as the leader, try to give them content that's not the same every year. And, not just read the words of the Haggadah, but, why did I volunteer to do this Pesach webinar? So it would force me to think about the Haggadah, so I would have new material. But I think a lot of people are intellectually curious, and they don't dumb down the Seder and make it just for children. Give adults, anybody who's intellectually curious, material that they can think about. So those are some of the things. I'll give you one, I'm going to divulge a detail which I want you not to tell anybody else. A young man at the end of my second Seder for young people last year said to me, when we collect the afikomen envelopes and we return them at the end of the meal, he said, why don't you put chocolate matzah in the afikomen envelope as a surprise at the end of the meal? So I thought, what a great idea, and I went out and I bought parva chocolate matzah, enough for everybody at the second Seder, but the only chocolate matzah I could find that was parva is egg matzah. So we're not going to swap out the broken matzah from the afikomen, but we're going to slip in chocolate matzah in addition to the matzah that's already there to give them a little surprise at the end of the meal. So I would say anything you can do, you all know these things, little frogs, whatever. And I'll also say the following. I'm a little bit annoyed at the commercial people who are, when you go to Judaica stores, what do you find there? Puppets of the 10 plagues and plague bags and so on. Yes, I understand how much fun children have talking about Dam Tzvardei Akinim, and we sing the frog song at the second Seder, but I am personally opposed to spending this much time on the 10 plagues. What I do at my Seder is I ask them, again as a table activity, to come up with a contemporary plague. This is also a lot of people doing this, that aligns with the 10 plagues or just any social ill. And then when my cantor goes Dam, at the various tables, they all yell out whatever they see as a contemporary plague, either connected to Dam or not connected to Dam, and so on. And these are, let's put it this way, the more you can get people involved in the leadership of the Seder, in the active participation in the Seder, the more meaningful and enjoyable it's going to be for them.
I love the idea that you mentioned of, sort of the surprise designation of a leader at each table, because it sends a real message of empowerment. But you also can be the leader, and you didn't even know it.
Yes, that's a very nice way of putting it. And people get excited. Sometimes people come back for the Seder, year after year. They choose their place. They open up the Haggadah, either to avoid being a leader, but usually to get to be the leader. Yes.
All right, so I think we're just about out of time. I don't know if you wanted to say any final word.
All I can say is, if you think that you've already figured out everything there is to know about the Haggadah and you have nothing new, next year, let alone this year, next year you will find new things in the Haggadah. I just learned what I told you about the Coleman. I learned it yesterday because this is the JPS commentary on the Haggadah. I read it in the JPS commentary in this wonderful volume on the Haggadah. So there's no end to new material in the traditional sense. I don't usually download from all these websites, all these organizational pushes for their material. I believe that in traditional Haggadah, you can find new, meaningful, inspiring ideas year after year.
Thank you. Your technical questions, asking for references and that kind of thing, we will answer by email. And please do us a favor and fill out the evaluation that appears below the video screen. It just takes about 30 seconds, and we read them all, and they're very helpful to us. Thank you again to Rabbi Hauptman, and we wish you all Chag Kasher V'Sameach.